Good afternoon all. My name is Talha Köse. I am the director of SETA Brussels office. So it's our great pleasure to host this panel titled EU-Turkey Statement, Reassessment of the Migration Agreement, with the joining of very distinguished speakers and guests today. So as SETA Foundation, we try to bring critical issues to the attention of policymakers, academics, and Turkish and international audience. Today, we will focus on Turkey-EU relations with specific reference to the EU-Turkey statement. March 18 marks the 5th anniversary of the EU-Turkey statement. It is at the same time 10th anniversary of the ongoing bloody civil war in Syria, which started with the peaceful popular demonstrations. So both Turkey and EU countries suffered from civil wars and turmoils in the MENA region. The EU-Turkey statement has managed to reduce the flow of irregular migrants to Europe significantly. In return, EU provided financial aid to Turkey and shared some of the humanitarian burden. There has been both constructive and critical voices related to the agreement. The details and the practical consequences of the agreement were not elaborated deeply in the policy circles and the public recently. So the agreement survived despite the criticism and the turbulent relations between Turkey and EU. So today, the agreement serves as the important bridge between Turkey and the EU. So we have very distinguished today's guests today to discuss the agreement. So we have Ibrahim Kalın, and he's the presidential spokesperson. But before Ibrahim Kalın, I will give floor to two partners of this meeting, Burhanettin Duran, Professor Burhanettin Duran, the Director General of SETA Foundation, and Gerald Naus. He is the chairman of the European Stability Initiative. He was one of the founders of this agreement. So I will give the floor to Professor Duran. So there is no need to explain his. I mean, he's an expert on many other issues, including the Turkish political thought, transformation of Islamism, Turkish foreign policy, and he has published and he has he's been writing on Daily Sabah and actively contributing to debates in Turkey. So I will give floor to Professor Duran for his introductory remark.
Thank you, Professor Köse. Mr. Kalın, Mr. Knaus, distinguished guests and speakers, and respective audience who is currently following us online via our social media accounts. On the 18th March 2016, Turkey and the European Union reached an agreement to cooperate about the crisis related to the flow of irregular migrants escaping from the civil wars, especially from Syria. You will remember that European leaders were startled and paralyzed in the wake of an unexpected refugee flow to their countries. Forgotten borders of European countries were restored to prevent refugee flows. The refugee crisis also marked the humanitarian tragedy of millions of people. You will again remember that with the strategic death of the 2-year-old Syrian Kurdish Alan Kurdi in the Mediterranean in 2015, the irregular migration crisis came inevitably into focus of the international community. The EU-Turkey statement was a significant step by Turkish and European officials to find a collaborative solution to this migration crisis, and also to prevent humanitarian tragedy and sufferings of Syrian, Iraqi, and Afghan refugees. These people were fleeing their countries to find safe shelter to continue their lives under more humane conditions. Turkey started the dialogue with the European Union as an immediate neighbor because European Union was an affected party in order to deal with this humanitarian crisis. After the uprisings in the neighboring country, Syria, Turkey opened its doors to millions of Syrian refugees to take refuge in Turkey. Certainly, many of the Syrian refugees were aiming to migrate to Europe. But according to the irregular migration policy conducted by the European Union, these refugees risk to take a dangerous journey through the Mediterranean by means of the help of smugglers and boats in poor condition in order to arrive in Greece and Europe, no matter how. Currently, 2.6 million Syrian refugees and around 370,000 registered refugees from other countries like from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iran are hosted in Turkey, which has a population of 83 million people. Whereas the European Union, approximately 500 million inhabitants, accepted around just 1 million refugees in total. In 2 days, this statement will mark its 5th anniversary. Since the implementation of the EU-Turkey statement, a lot of developments and conflict of interest occurred, be it financial problem or the treatment of the migrants who aim to arrive in the European Union. Today, we are here to evaluate the past 5 years and the future of the statement. EU-Turkey statement, in my opinion, is a great success in terms of preventing the humanitarian suffering of irregular migrants, because the statement signified the importance of collaboration and joint action in the humanitarian problems. The success of this statement for the prevention of further humanitarian tragedies, unfortunately, has been shadowed by the controversial political maneuvers of some European politicians. Despite all the disappointments from the European side, Turkey continued to be committed to the agreement. It is something good to hear, to see that Turkey and the European Union nowadays seek a positive agenda. This positive agenda would serve the interest of both parties if the European Council's meeting on March 25 and 6 transforms that pursuit into a concrete policy regarding the worsening migration crisis affecting different societies and millions of refugees, be it in Europe or in Turkey. After all, it's high time that Turkey-EU relationship undergoes a strategic reassessment. Recently, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had a productive conversation with French President Macron and with German Chancellor Merkel in the last weeks. These are important occurrences regarding future cooperation possibilities. The matter of fact that German Chancellor Merkel has traditionally appreciated Ankara's crucial role in European migration and security policies, and she adopted a constructive approach to deal with all these problems. Furthermore, Macron's softened stance, however, is interesting and something good, and having disagreed with the Turks on Syria, Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, Nagorno-Karabakh, now Paris seems pleased to find an opportunity to exchange views on these all issues. And this is a positive development for the reviving or updating this statement between Turkey and the European Union. For me, the relationship between Turkey and the European Union is characterized by interdependence on countless issues. You may count migration, the war on terror, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and Russia. These are the ones that immediately come to my mind. This distinguished cooperation could be extracted from mutual interest and cooperation areas, promoted time by time, but sometimes it is challenged by some tensions. But I think we have more to develop new levels of mutual understanding and cooperation areas through regional and international mechanisms to provide and sustain long-term security, economy, stability, and humanitarian aid. And this is something vital for the future of the European continent and Turkey as well. I hope this panel will display the existing level of relations and discuss how both actors, Turkey and Europe, would go further in terms of humanitarian international cooperation and other fields as well. By my best wishes in mind, I'd like to thank you in advance for your contributions for today's panel. This panel aims to strengthen the Turkish-European cooperation, and I hope to see more deeper partnership between both actors in order to facilitate difficult conditions for refugees. in the near future, or in order to focus more on this humanitarian crisis? Well, from now, I thank all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Duran. So I will now pass to Gerald Naus on behalf of European Stability Initiative. So Dr. Naus is often considered as one of the minds behind this agreement. So he has extensive experience as a scholar, as a researcher. So he worked as a member of European Council of Foreign Relations, as fellow at Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard University, and Mercator IPC Senior Fellow in Istanbul. So he's now based in Berlin, so his contributions are very important. So now I'll give the brief opening to Gerald.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, and I would like to thank SETA for this opportunity. It's a great opportunity. It's nice to be back in touch with some key players already from 5 years ago, and it's nice also because this is a moment of great urgency. We all know, and it's been 10 years, that the Syrian refugee crisis is the biggest refugee crisis in the world and has been for decades. The last time there were so many refugees from one conflict was in the early 1970s. And we also know that of the 10 million additional refugees in the world in the last decade, the number increased from 10 to 20 million between 2010 and 2020. 1/3 of those additional refugees in the world are in Turkey. Now, this has created an unprecedented situation, and it's very important to appreciate that without cooperation, that is, yes, interest-based, but also based on values, to confront this refugee crisis between the European Union and Turkey, this ongoing catastrophe and tragedy will not come to a good end. Now, we have had in the last 5 years 2 moments at which the number of refugees crossing in boats from Turkey to the European Union has changed quickly. 2 moments which, however, could not be more different in how they were achieved. In March 2016, the EU and Turkey reached the 18 March EU-Turkey statement. And as we know, and if we look at the numbers, the number of people who crossed from Turkey to the European Union went from 1 million in 12 months to 26,000 in the 12 months after this. Now, this was through cooperation, through the EU raising money to support refugees in Turkey, through the EU promising to take refugees from Turkey, and through Turkey saying that from a cut-off date, so not what happened before, but from a cut-off date, it was prepared to take back those from Greece, from the islands, who the Greek asylum system said could be returned according to EU law. Now, this agreement stabilized the numbers and reduced the number of deaths drastically. Before, in the 12 months before, more than 1,100 people died. In the 12 months after, it was around 80. So we can really say that this diplomatic breakthrough saved lives. Now let's look at the second moment, which happened a year ago, which again reduced the number of people coming from Turkey to the European Union. In the 12 months before March 2020, around 62,000 people reached Greece. In the last 12 months, it was less than 3,000. But here's the problem. The way this last reduction in numbers was achieved was not through cooperation between the European Union and Turkey. It was by employing methods, pushbacks, deterrence, unilaterally on the part of the European Union, that in fact European law, the Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights were violated. This is what my colleagues and I had been warning about for the last 5 years. We knew if states are determined to stop migrants, they can do it. But if states are determined to do it in line with the European Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention, then they need partners. In the last year, the strategy of many in the European Union, and not only on the Greek-Turkish border, but also on the Croatian-Bosnian border and on the Hungarian-Serbian border, was through pushbacks, which are illegal, to deter arrivals, which is a terrible signal in the 70th year of the UN Refugee Convention, which was signed just 70 years ago. So the choice for us today is, can we go back to what has worked and improve on it? The cooperation between the European Union and Turkey from the 18th of March 2016. Or are Europeans, are members of the European Union, are publics, are politicians content with using deterrence, brutality, and the breakdown of the rule of law to stop people leaving? Now, we know that in the European Union, there is a debate. There are governments who say the status quo is fine. And there are other governments that say, no, the European Union stands for the rule of law. It stands for the Refugee Convention. What is happening now is unacceptable. And here we come to what is the urgency of this moment. We need a restoration, a revision of the EU-Turkey statement. Like in March 2016, and I hope this happens as soon as possible, and I would have hoped it would have happened by the 5th anniversary. But if it happens this March, all the better. Turkey and the EU should again re-engage. Now, what does that mean concretely? It means that the European Union must remember that Turkey still carries a huge burden, a responsibility for the biggest number of refugees in the world. It should put on the table another substantial sum of money to fund education, healthcare, and social support for refugees in Turkey. It should also, as it had promised, and as was implemented but very modestly, return to the idea of bringing more refugees from Turkey into the European Union in an orderly way, to resettle people. It should, thirdly, engage in a more intense dialogue with Turkey and bring in the United States and others on what to do about the ongoing catastrophe of internally displaced Syrians in the northwest of Syria, which is not only a problem for Turkey, which is at the border, but which should be a humanitarian priority to address by the whole civilized world. This is why I would be hoping, and today my colleagues and I put online a draft proposal of how a new EU-Turkey statement could look after a lot of conversations I had with friends in Brussels, in Berlin, in Athens, and in Ankara. A draft proposal for debate, because in the end what we need is we need politicians and governments courageous enough to put such a proposal on the table and say, let's repeat what we had 5 years ago. 5 years ago was win, win, win. Win for Turkey, win for the European Union, and win for the global refugee protection system. What we had in the last 12 months was lose, lose, lose. No more promises of additional funding from the European Union. No more rule of law in the Aegean, and instead pushbacks and at the expense of refugees. And for the European Union, the loss of one of its core values, the adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention. Let's get out of the lose, lose, lose to win, win, win. Let's have the same courage and vision with a realistic, mutual, interest-based and value-driven new agreement. And I hope this meeting will contribute to getting a step closer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gerald. So we will have an opportunity to discuss further the debate after our keynote speech. So our keynote speaker is Professor and Ambassador Ibrahim Kalın, who is the presidential spokesperson, ambassador, chief advisor, and deputy chairman of the Security and Foreign Policy Council of Turkish Presidency. So he served as the Assistant Under Secretary of State and Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister of Turkey. And he was the founding director of SETA Foundation, which we had an opportunity to work together in the past. In addition to his policy-related experience, he's a prolific writer and intellectual who has been contributing to post-Avicenna philosophy. So he taught philosophy and different things before, and also prolific writer. So today, definitely, he will talk about this EU-Turkey statement and future of Turkey-EU relations. So it's a great honor and pleasure to have you here, Ambassador Kalın.
Thank you, Talha. I want to thank, first of all, SETA Foundation for inviting me to this panel, which I hope and I agree with Gerald will contribute to the updating and taking stock of where we are in regards to the migration crisis, the Syrian war, and Turkey-EU relations. And both speakers before me, both Burhanettin and Gerald, provided a very useful framework for where we are after 5 years, 5 years after the migration deal, also 10 years after the beginning of the Syrian war. I want to address maybe this issue at three levels. First of all, the Syrian war in its 10th year. As we are in the month of March in 2021, we all remember how things started in Syria about 10 years ago. Peaceful protesters asking for more freedom and better services from their government. And they faced in unbelievable, brutal force, catastrophe, killing, and collective executions by the Assad regime. And unfortunately, things have not gone any better ever since then. And God knows how many people have died, but a moderate estimate will be around 1 million or so people have died in the Syrian conflict. And all kinds of war crimes have been committed in the Syrian war. And we have tried everything we can with some international partners to stop this war. But unfortunately, we all have failed. And now still there is a lot of pessimism about where to go, what future will bring to the Syrian conflict. Syria has been destroyed as a country. The Syrian people have carried the heaviest burden in this conflict, with more than half of Syria's population becoming either refugees or IDPs in their own land. And the Syrian war has been the source of many crises, migration crisis, terrorism, the rise of Daesh in certain parts of Syria, the rise of PKK terrorism in northern Syria, and having tensions or leading to tensions between Turkey and its neighbors, but also between Turkey and countries like the United States that have began supporting PYD, YPG in Syria under the Obama administration. Then that has restrained relations between two NATO allies. And if you look at the Syrian map today, it's not a very good picture. The country is practically divided between 2-3 different large areas, areas controlled by the Assad regime, which many refugees in Turkey and elsewhere, in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and other places, do not find safe to return to. Then there are parts controlled by PYD, YPG with American support. Then there are areas under our control. Then there are areas under the control of Iranian militia groups, and so on and so forth. Of course, the Russian military presence. In its 10th year, the Syrian war presents a bleak picture, unfortunately. The reason I mention this here is that the root cause of the migration crisis, which led to the signing of the 2016 Turkey-EU immigration agreement, or March statement as it was called, is this war. And as long as we avoid addressing this root cause, the Syrian war itself, we will not be able to find a lasting, sustainable solution to the migration crisis. Now, let me turn to the second issue, which is the migration crisis itself, which has come out of the Syrian war, but now it has reached international dimensions. Over the last 6-7 years especially, the international community has largely failed the Syrian people in its policy and attitude towards the immigrants. Unfortunately, the European attitude in general has been, well, as long as they're out there, as long as they are far away from our capitals and borders, the issue is not an issue for us. It's not an urgent issue. It's not an international issue. It's not a pressing issue. Unfortunately, that has been the attitude. But ignoring a problem doesn't mean that you solve it. It's still out there. You turn your a blind eye, to it. You turn your back to it. It doesn't go away. The problem is still there. And from a purely humanitarian or humanistic point of view, if you like, all the values that we claim to champion in the name of the sacrality of human life, equal opportunity, human rights, human dignity have been violated with this migration crisis. And of course, that's not the guilt or the fault of the Syrian refugees, as well as millions of other refugees coming from Africa or Afghanistan or other places, but it's the guilt and the shame of the international community with all its economic might and military power and political clout has failed to address this issue. The scenes that we have seen in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea will be there forever. I think when the historians write this years back, look at this period in history, I think they will present a picture that we will not be proud of as international community. But especially in regards to the European attitude, and I have to be blunt here, we have seen some of the worst attitudes and treatments of the refugees. And most recently, we are seeing this repeated again in the pushbacks, as Gerald pointed out. This is the pushbacks, by the way, in recent months have gone up in numbers, in size, in frequency. We are seeing Greek authorities pushing people back, the refugees, the migrants, back to Turkey and to other places, which is in clear violation of all the international conventions, UN decisions, as well as the European values and the written statements or the points and clauses that were included in the 18th March statement. Unfortunately, we sometimes see Frontex, the main European institution, which is supposed to monitor all this, taking part in this pushbacks and helping the Greeks. And unfortunately, the European Union as a whole have not raised their voice over this pushbacks in the name of union solidarity, European EU dynamics, politics, etc. They have given a carte blanche to Greek authorities in their inhumane treatment of these refugees. The migration crisis, in short, is still there. Because of the pandemic, our attention has been now diverted to some other issues. But as I said, the migration crisis is still there. It will not go away as long as we continue to act in the way that we've been acting over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, in the middle of all this, we had this very important agreement 5 years ago. In 2 days' time, we will be celebrating or commemorating the 5th anniversary of the March 18th statement between Turkey and EU on migration. And I agree with my colleagues that this has turned out to be an important turning point and also a success story. And it shows the extent to which when Turkey and the EU work together, how much we can achieve in preventing a major humanitarian and political crisis. Certainly the agreement has worked in some areas, but it has failed to produce the expected results that we had hoped that it will result. Areas in which it worked, certainly it reduced the number of illegal migrants to Europe, and that's considered to be a good thing for Europe and EU. Okay, that's fine. But in terms of the loss of life, in terms of the treatment of the refugees, and the sense that hope or hopelessness that all this attitude policies have given to the Syrian refugees themselves, we have a major failure there. Because of the pandemic, the issue is kind of on hold for the time being, but it cannot be sustained as it is forever. No single country, Turkey or Germany or any other country, can shoulder this huge responsibility alone. This is the responsibility of the international community, but unfortunately, I am personally not seeing enough commitment, enough political will from the European side, certain EU member countries to tackle this issue. As I said, their attitude is that as long as it's not at my door, it's not my problem. But the reality is that, well, it's a regional problem with global dimensions. If you don't address this issue now together, it will come back to haunt us in many different ways that we wouldn't expect. The March 18th statement will enter its 5th year in 2 days. That calls for a reckoning, for a stock taking of where we are. Look at the situation. Back in 2016, when we signed the agreement, we have about 2.5 or 6 million refugees in Turkey, majority of them from Syria. Today, we have 4 million refugees in Turkey. Again, the majority of them Syrians, about 3.7. And we have others from Afghanistan, from Libya, from Iran, and from other parts of the world. The refugee problem is not going anywhere. The numbers are increasing. The problems that the refugees are facing are deepening. Therefore, this calls for urgent action before this becomes again unsustainable, uncontrollable, and we face another major humanitarian crisis. Scenes of people and babies dying in the Mediterranean or the Aegean or at the border with pushbacks and other inhumane treatments of these people. Secondly, in 5 years, a lot of dynamics have changed. The refugee crisis is still there, but the specific dynamics have changed. For example, 5 years ago, when we signed the agreement, emphasis was on investing more in infrastructure like schools and hospitals and shelters and things like that. Majority of these issues have been addressed now. The needs are different. The educational and medical needs, for example, have become more prominent today. The infrastructure issues have been addressed. We have shelters, we have container houses, we have tents, and we have people also living in cities in Syria, in Turkey, along the Turkish-Syrian border. On the Syrian side, more IDPs have moved towards the Turkish-Syrian border. The reason is that they do not feel safe, either under Assad regime-controlled areas or under areas controlled by PYD-YPG. We are committed to the UN principle of returning refugees to their home cities in Syria freely, voluntarily, safely, and in a dignified manner. All these three conditions need to be met for these people to go back. That is, they have to do this on a voluntary basis, in a safe manner, and in a dignified way. And about 480,000 or so refugees from Turkey to Syria have returned to areas under our control, from Afrin to Jarablus, Tel Abyad, and other places, but not to areas under the Assad regime control, under Russian-Iranian control, or under PYD-YPG control. That actually speaks volumes about the situation in Syria and how we should address this issue today. That is, we cannot expect the refugees from Syria or somewhere else to be refugees for the rest of their lives. Ultimately, all we aim to achieve is to create conditions, allow them to go back to their home cities and towns and to their own country. But this requires a collective work. This requires the work of all the key stakeholders and key players from Turkey to EU, from Germany to France, from United States to other neighboring countries, to Russia, Iran, and others. But I don't see this concerted effort taking place. Turkey is providing shelter and food and medical services to about 4 million refugees in Turkey, but also another 5 to 6 million IDPs on the Syrian side. So when you put all this together, we are taking care of, Turkey alone is taking care of about 10 million Syrian refugees. That's almost half of Syria's entire population. And then you have other refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, and other places, those who were able to make it to Europe and the United States, much smaller, of course, in size compared to the numbers that we have here, are actually, trying to survive. They're not having an easy life either. They're subject to all kinds of discrimination and intimidation, all the problems that minority communities face. They are subjected to this, especially with the threat of extreme far-right Islamophobia, xenophobia in certain European countries. Now, given all this, Turkey-EU migration deal was a success, and I want to underline the role that Chancellor Merkel played in that process almost single-handedly. I mean, she was probably the only European leader at that time who put the political will that was required to make this happen. and she paid the political price for it. But she turned out to be right. As Gerald mentioned certain numbers, I don't want to repeat them here. The number of illegal immigrants trying to enter Europe through Greece, islands, Bulgaria, and Italy, and other places were reduced dramatically in a matter of 10 months. At one point, almost 100,000 people were trying to enter illegally into Europe per month. That number went down to like 2,000-3,000, even less at some point. But as I said, as things stand, as the refugee crisis continues, and there's millions of people remain cut off from their homeland and need a lasting long-term solution, this current status quo cannot be sustainable. Therefore, those who think in the EU that the status quo is fine, we can just keep it like that, we can give Turkey a few more billion euros and this will take care of the problem. I know some member countries think like that, and it's a mistake. It's a major mistake for them to think this way. This cannot go on like this forever. We are in negotiations at the moment with our EU counterparts to update the migration deal. And this brings me to the second part of my third point, that's Turkey-EU relations. There we have an opportunity. I think Turkey-EU migration deal was a joint success story with some failings in certain areas because, as you all know, 6 billion euros were committed for 2 years, and it's been 5 years, and only a little more than half of that money has been spent so far, about 3.2 or 3 billion euros. Yes, 6 billion has been contracted, but in terms of actual delivery and the money reaching people, only half, a little bit more than half of it has reached the people. That money, as we've been saying, doesn't come to Turkey's coffers. It doesn't come to our own budget. It goes straight to the refugees through international institutions and organizations, some through UN, some through local NGOs and others. But given the size and enormity of the problem, that measure is so insufficient. There is more we have to do, we must do, to address this issue. So the issue is not just about putting some more additional money. It's a matter of addressing this issue in a humane way, in a way that will end the conflict, address the root cause of this problem. And the international community, primarily European Union, the United States, us, all of us, taking a more resilient, more proactive, effective position to address this issue, rather than kind of let it simmer out there, let it just run its course. It will not run its course unless we take action in the right direction. And there I think as we continue this talk and negotiations now to update the migration deal, it is important to read the picture properly. The picture is not a good one. We have to do more. It puts more responsibility on our shoulders than anyone else. Now, in regards to the Turkey-EU relations, how this affects Turkey-EU relations, migration deal is only one component of the many dimensions and aspects of Turkey-EU relations. As part of the migration deal of March 18 statement, there was a roadmap to be implemented to advance Turkey's EU membership, to strengthen Turkey-EU relationship institutionally, and also in other areas. Unfortunately, none of that has been implemented by the European side. We have clauses, about, for example, strengthening Turkey's accession perspective, updating the customs union, encouraging and facilitating, enabling visa liberalization for Turkish citizens, opening up of new chapters, increasing high-level political dialogues, revitalizing political consultation mechanisms. And all these 5-6 major items that I just mentioned are actually included in the March 18th statement. They're still there. Unfortunately, none of that has been implemented. So people usually tend to focus on just this 3.3 billion euro issue. but there were many other elements there, and they are still there. Unless someone says this agreement is no longer valid, you know, they are still there, they are still binding, and they actually place a responsibility on the shoulders of the European officials. And, you know, I've been involved in these talks for a number of years. Exactly a year from today, a year ago, our President Erdogan, visited Brussels and had a very constructive, detailed meeting with President Michel and President von der Leyen to talk about this issue, updating the migration deal a year ago. And we agreed on having a roadmap. And Mr. Borrell and our foreign minister, Mr. Çavuşoğlu, were mandated to follow up on this issue. Our foreign ministry presented a roadmap in writing, very practical, feasible, doable roadmap. It's been 1 year since then. Unfortunately, none of that has been implemented. Yes, we had the COVID-19. That was a major distraction. All of us were focused on this issue, but it's not really an excuse. Now we are talking again. I just hosted my European EU colleagues last week in Istanbul. We had a very good meeting, by the way. It was very constructive, and I'm glad my colleagues were kind enough to come, and I know they care about this issue, and I know they want to put you know, effort into this seriously, but I know they also have to deal with the dynamics of the European Union, other members that have their own narrow political agenda, that have their own bilateral issues with Turkey, over which they want to hijack the entire EU perspective. And all this, I know, proved to be very difficult for them to move forward. But the reality is that it's been 1 year since we've talked about having a roadmap and updating the migration deal, and we still don't have a clear guideline or roadmap or timetable. As we are approaching the EU summit on March 25th, 26th, you know, my hope, our hope, expectation is that EU leaders will show leadership there and address this migration issue in a serious manner, in line with the values of the EU, in line with the values and principles of the international conventions, but also in line of, in view of the fact that as long as the Syrian conflict continues, the war remains and the country remains completely shattered. The migration crisis will come back in so many different forms and shapes and ways. We cannot let that continue for another 5 years or 10 years. I think it's time to take action. That requires bold leadership and strategic vision. And I hope the March 25th, 26th EU summit will display that, will carry that spirit. And that way we can confidently and proudly, but also humbly, tell the Syrian refugees, women and children, that we care about you, that we want to solve this problem. We want to help you. We want you to feel welcome. We want you to feel at home. We want you to feel that you are equal, you are entitled to equal opportunities and a decent, dignified life just like anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cullen. So you mentioned that the agreement was a great success in the beginning. However, there is a serious impasse that needs to be overcome by some, you know, concrete action. So, as SETA and as ESI, we will try to work further on this issue and find some more concrete steps. And we would also like to thank you for your efforts to improve Turkish-EU relations, especially in the last several months. I think it's moving into positive momentum and hoping to see more concrete results in the March summit. So we would like to thank you and our keynote speakers. And in the second part of this meeting, we will focus more on the report and also discussion of the deal. At SETA, we have been investigating on some of the details of the report and possible ways to update the EU-Turkey statement. So we will give a 5 minutes break and 2 minutes break, and we will continue with the panel for discussing the statement. I would like to thank a lot for the keynote speech of Ambassador Ibrahim Kalın. So he has been struggling effortlessly to continue this agreement. And as scholars and researchers, there's an extensive research about the consequence of the agreement and possible ways to update and possible ways to stimulate further action. So in the second session, we have three very distinguished guests who will discuss the updating of the agreement and also possible action points in this regard. So we have three speakers. We will again start with Professor Gerald Naus from European Stability Initiatives. So we will have more opportunities to discuss some of the details and some of your views with regard to updating of the report in this section. So the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot. Let me try and see if I can share the screen, share screen, because I prepared a few slides. This might work. Wait. Okay. Does it work? One second.
Yes.
Okay. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So let me go back to the beginning. Well, this is great, this opportunity. Let me try to be as precise and as concrete as possible. And let me try to talk about what this revised EU-Turkey statement that would build on the successes and redress the failures, that would work for both Turkey and the EU, and that would work for the global refugee system, how it might look like. Now, I started again with these numbers. These are the numbers, the official numbers of sea arrivals in Greece per month from Turkey in the Aegean. And it's really striking if you look at it, because what you see here is that you had the 12 months from April 2015 to March 2016, when you literally, if you add up these numbers, you arrive at 1 million people who crossed in 12 months. And then in April, of course, the first months after the EU-Turkey statement, the numbers dropped drastically to 26,000. But if you move to 2020, you see the other story, which is which is different. You also see a sharp drop in numbers. In the 12 months before, from April to March, you had 62,000 people arrive. in the 12 months since the middle of March last year, we have less than 3,000. But that is where we are now, with methods that for Europe, for the refugee system and for Turkey should not be acceptable. Now, the 2016 agreement had these three parts, the central part, and I go to the others in a second, that from a cut-off date, there would be returns to Turkey, not the people who had arrived before. In return, there would be a voluntary humanitarian admission scheme, a larger number of people brought from Turkey to the EU. Now, as we know, so far, this has been less than 30,000. And finally, there would be EU support for refugees in Turkey. 4 more parts, and they've been mentioned by Ambassador Kalin. The EU committed to jointly improve humanitarian conditions inside Syria with Turkey. And this has been even more urgent now than it was. It was always urgent, but it's even more urgent now because the numbers of people who need to be supported in Syria is increasing sharply in the last years. And there was a point about visa liberalization when roadmap conditions are fulfilled. That, of course, has to be kept in the new agreement. There would be ongoing work on upgrading a customs union. Well, we know that that depends on unanimity in the European Council, on all member states agreeing. And there was a reference to the accession process, which I can tell you is in crisis, not just with Turkey, but with every candidate, including in the Balkans. Now, we already know what the agreement achieved in April 2016. Numbers of people arriving dropped. Numbers of people who drowned dropped. We also know, however, that one thing which didn't work well was returns from Greece to Turkey. 143,000 people arrived on the islands until December 2019. Until then, 2,000 people were returned to Turkey, which created this constant crisis on the Greek islands, where people were kept for much too long under terrible conditions. But then in the end, nobody was returned to Turkey. So in the last 12 months, of course, the real problem is, and we've referred to it, is that it is no longer the methods foreseen in the agreement which reduce arrivals, but it is pushbacks. Now, this has been reported on by international media. It has been reported on by international organizations, by NGOs, and of course by the Turkish Coast Guard, estimating that some 9,000 pushbacks have taken place at sea last year. And this makes one think of another example in another part of the world, the Australian approach, which basically has been pushbacks now being transferred to Europe. So Croatia is doing pushbacks to Bosnia, Hungary is doing pushbacks to Serbia. On the Greek border, we have pushbacks to Turkey. And of course, deterrence through bad conditions, which is also something Australia has done on the island of Nauru, and which we have seen, again, we see it in Bosnia, on the border where Croatia pushes people back, and we've seen it on the Greek islands. Inhumane conditions where families are kept for far too long. So in 2016, we had a win-win-win. In 2020, we have a lose-lose-lose. There's no promise of more money for Turkey at the moment. There is a low number of people who are being resettled from Turkey. There is a terrible situation for those few who still cross to the Greek islands. And there is a loss for anyone like myself in the European Union who wants the European Union to stick to its values, to respect the European Convention on Human Rights, to not do pushbacks, and to respect the Refugee Convention. So here I just run through what my colleagues put online just this morning, how a new agreement could look like, and then we can have a debate. And this is just a proposal by a think tank. Of course, it's governments that need to agree to it. And there will always be changes. But here is how it might look like if, for example, one of the players in these debates puts it on the table. Now, the first point is it needs to confirm the specific commitments made before. So what has been agreed before, these specific commitments, they remain alive. It must be clear that Greece and the European Union will support Greece, will act in line with the UN Refugee Convention. That means anybody who arrives in Greek waters will be registered and can apply for asylum. There must not be pushbacks, and this should be monitored. At the same time, Turkey will accept the return of those who do not need international protection and who cross, and I would recommend extending the agreement also to the land border. There's no point in having an agreement on the sea border when at the same time this pushes people to try to cross the Evros, and we have violence and confrontations on the Evros. The goal should be that there should be less irregular migration on all borders in return for more regular resettlement that is orderly. Now, migrants who are not applying for asylum or whose applications in the EU are found inadmissible and who cross after, and here's of course a question for debate, will you do again, or could Turkey and the EU agree again a new date? Now there are 15,000 people on the Greek islands. My sense from talking to diplomats in Turkey is that they will not be taken back. And in fact, it doesn't make much of a difference. If you reach a new date and say from now on, Turkey will take people back again, the goal, of course, is that then people stop coming and there will be very few returns. And there must be no collective expulsion. At the same time, it would be very useful to build on this, because this was missing, to have some sort of joint monitoring mechanism, which monitors both that the EU and that Turkey, so all parties, act in line with this agreement, in line with the European Convention on Human Rights and judgments by that court, which means simply those who are returned from Greece to Turkey will be treated, and Turkey has always said it does that, in line with the promises. So if they are Syrians, they get the status again that Syrians in Turkey could get before, but also on the EU side, that those who reach the Greek islands will not be put on plastic boats and pushed back to Turkey. This should be monitored. And there's one more addition that should be discussed. Would it be possible that UNHCR in Turkey, and this is something that was agreed between Malaysia and Australia as an alternative to Nauru in 2011, and I will write about this more in a report that comes out tomorrow, that UNHCR could say it would process asylum applications of those who are returned from Greece to Turkey who are not Syrians. This would stop irregular arrivals. It has been done in the past by the UNHCR for decades. Then, of course, other countries and the European Union will have to help UNHCR to again resettle those who get protection in Turkey in larger numbers to the rest of the world. Then, of course, one needs to find a number to finally move the voluntary humanitarian admission scheme, part 4 of the agreement, which means that refugees from Turkey, vulnerable refugees, can be taken to the European Union without smugglers. And there should be a number set, we recommend, for the next 4 years. So each year, but with Corona, we don't know how fast it will start, a total number for 4 years. And this is something that would be important for Greece. You subtract only those who arrive irregularly during this period and who will not be returned. The goal is that you move away from irregular migration to regular migration without breaking international law. Of course, the European Union needs to come up with more money, and as Ambassador Kalin has said, it needs to also be targeted at the needs which exist today, including the communities hosting refugees. They should be supported also to help vulnerable Turkish citizens, because, of course, if you have a community with 10 or 20% refugees in the community, the needs affect everyone, and this makes sense and should be part of a FRIT 3, a facility for refugees in Turkey 3. Finally, this needs to be taken more seriously to improve humanitarian conditions inside Turkey, inside Syria. And we recommend a global summit this summer to discuss, similar to the UN summit in Geneva, to discuss in 1979 and in 1989, the situation of the boat people. There was a huge crisis with refugees in the South China Sea. We need a similar summit of those countries that have an interest and are willing to help. Germany, France, the European Union, America, Canada, and Turkey, and others. Because the crisis of Syria requires a serious and global response. And at the moment, I fear Ambassador Kalin is right. Many are thinking that the crisis of the people, 3 million people in northwest Syria, the IDPs who can't go back because they're afraid of Assad, risks being forgotten. Now, there are other things that will be discussed, but what I'm saying is that if this agreement, based on these principles, could be renewed, and ideally this will happen within the next few days, ideally before the end of this month, then this would be a real response to what is always important to remember, is the biggest refugee crisis in the world in decades. I was referring to this before, here you see it. According to the UNHCR Global Trends reports, there were 11 million refugees in 2013 and 20 million in 2019. The 9 million increase of refugees in the world, 3 million of that increase are just in Turkey. Almost 1 million increase was in Germany. So if you look at where the number of refugees in the world has increased, if Germany, the European Union, and Turkey can reach a new agreement, it is the biggest players who've accepted most refugees in the last decade, in the last 8 years in the world who are engaged. March 2016, a win-win-win statement was reached. This is possible again. It will take leadership. And the sooner it is done, the better. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the debate.
Questions after other presentations, but your highlights about the global response and also the changing nature of the response mechanism, unfortunately, and inhumane formats were very important and needs to be taken into account. I think we will have more opportunities to discuss the new challenges that emerged after the agreement. So I'm going to get to pass to our second speaker in this panel, Ammar Kahf. He is the co-founder and executive director of Omran Center for Strategic Studies, a Syria-focused policy research center based in Istanbul. So, of course, we have been discussing the issue from perspective of Europe, from perspective of Turkey and other affected countries. However, the main subjects are the Syrians, and mostly, definitely, there are some others. But I think it's very important to understand overall suffering, overall expectations, and the possible conditions that may allow Syrians to feel more secure and maybe to return their homes more safely, or if they cannot, the possible ways to improve their conditions. So Ammar has done extensive research and he has an extensive network with regard to the issues, problems of the Syrians. So he will reflect about Syrian perspective on this migration issue. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for SETA and the distinguished guests on this panel. I will give probably some brief remarks on the Syrian perspective of this deal. Obviously, as Syrian refugees, none of them was present. This is an EU-Turkey deal, so as an outsider to the agreement, commenting on 5 years afterwards, and again, as the ambassador mentioned, this is also the 10th anniversary of the Syria crisis, is that this remains a band-aid approach, meaning that, so this is my first point, is that, again, re-emphasizing what was mentioned before on dealing with the root causes of the migration crisis, that the migration crisis cannot be solved only by unilateral or bilateral deals. In fact, the refugees have declined in the month of March 2020 perhaps because of the Turkish-Russian agreement to halt the assault on Idlib, which resulted in over 1 million displaced. Only about 200 of them, 200,000 have returned since that de-escalation or freezing of or ceasefire agreement. So, it's a very complicated scene where only dealing with one piece of the puzzle and not looking at the big pieces of the big puzzle and the big elephants in the room really sometimes defeats the cause. So that's, I think, one of the issues is the entire approach of dealing with the refugee crisis as just a refugee crisis rather than a result of the lack of consistent policies on Syria itself. That for example, EU-Turkey differences get in the way of helping Syrians on the ground. That just because certain countries in Europe classify Turkish presence as quote-unquote occupation or otherwise is insignificant for Syrians. For Syrians, all they care is to have a dignified life in areas that they live in and to be safe in their homes and send their kids to school. And this applies to Syrians inside Syria in the north and to Syrians in Turkey, obviously, with huge differences in terms of the infrastructure and the institution. And so one of the recommendations I put forward is adding, and I think this was mentioned by some of the distinguished guests, is adding a component on stability programs in northern Syria, regardless of how it is classified by EU or international, disagreements with the Turkish policies, etc., that at least certain programs are intact inside Syria, so that people would think twice before being smuggled into Turkey first and risking their lives, also being shot sometimes at the borders, or even crossing further to Europe. So the hike, for example, of refugees in the first 3 months of 2020 was a direct result of the Russian aggression on Idlib and pushing people back. Has the agreement succeeded? Perhaps from a Turkish European perspective, it may have. And I certainly see all the great accomplishments that were mentioned. From the Syrian perspective, again, Syrians look at themselves as just numbers on this agreement, look at themselves as figures and numbers rather than as people who want to rebuild their lives and be able to, whether they return back to Turkey or whether they are stuck on the island in very inhumane conditions on Greek islands and suffering all the treatments with children and families. And many reports have reported people who have been, went through, including sexual abuse and other on the island and lack of services, or those who return to Turkey with the economic conditions of not being able to find jobs or having the temporary protection status that really provides a lot of basic services, but does not provide long-term stability for families, does not allow them to purchase homes or have stable conditions where they know that they will be here for a while. As the ambassador mentioned, that unfortunately the refugee crisis is not going anywhere. If this war is continuing, even if we freeze the military operations in Syria or a ceasefire, there will continue a lot of refugees that are not able to go and return to their original homes in other parts of Syria that are controlled by either the regime or the SDF forces on the northeast or PKK forces. And so what do you do about these? Do they remain as temporary or as just in the middle of international agreements between different areas? Obviously, the human suffering is one of the negative aspects of this agreement. Obviously not an intended consequence, but as a result of how it was implemented by Greek authorities, by the different parties on this agreement, the human suffering remains high. If we measure human suffering by just number of deaths, there are reports certainly that point to hidden numbers of deaths that are not reported necessarily by the dashboards of the international agreements. But there are other, obviously, hidden human costs of suffering during this process. This whole approach of externalizing migration policies, of subcontracting those migration policies outside of the European Union borders is very troubling as a think tank, as just a researcher, that this is just a troubling idea of pushing back the policies to another country to deal with, and just paying $6 billion. I mean, what is that compared to the total number of funds spent on refugees by Turkish authorities in Turkey and in northern Syria? This really is probably less than a fifth or less than 15% of the total cost. So this is really an insignificant. And the issue here, as mentioned before, is not just the amount of money that is being spent, but is the how, and is the messages that are sent within it to emphasize compliance with basic standards of living and giving people hope, giving people a way that they could think of 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where even those who receive a lot of public services, excellent public services in Turkey, but remain in this unknown condition of temporary protection, of am I going to stay here tomorrow? Can I purchase a home? Can I get a job? Is it easy to apply for a permit given that there's a high unemployment of Turkish citizens. And so this really is not an issue that the Turkish government is at fault. This is really a crisis that is much bigger than a single government that could magically find solutions. Certainly, there has been very significant institutional efforts. I mean, the migration department was established in Turkey just in 2013. A lot of new laws have been passed. The 2014 and others are catching up with a lot of the needs, but the needs are way beyond the capacities of one. And what's some people think that what happens in Syria remains in Syria, or what happens in Turkey remains. Is obviously we have porous borders, and the borders are very close, both physically and even in the cyber space. And so, has the agreement fulfilled the aspirations of Syrian refugees from Syrian refugee perspectives? I say that not very much. The scale is not very high on the bar. Through numerous refugees interviews that were conducted by some of the studies indicate that people, yes, there are a certain number of people, less than 25,000 were legally sent through this agreement, which is a very, very small number compared to the number of refugees that are still outflowing from Syria as a result of continued aggression. The issue of establishing a safe and neutral environment in Syria remains a big challenge. How do you create a safe environment when there still continues to be aggression by the different parties? There's always a temporary freeze of conflict here and there. It's always a band-aid approach of let's deal with this piece of the puzzle and leave the 10 other pieces, for somebody else to deal with, and that this is not our problem. This is just a problem between Europe and Turkey to deal with only the migration issues. And how do we look at that the success bar is only to lower the number of people that are being smuggled through the Aegean Sea? I see that as an important figure, as an important indicator, but not a representative of the full picture of refugee challenges in this world. So did the agreement create a safe environment in northern Syria that would prevent further outflows? Obviously, it did not even deal with it because it was concentrated on certain benefits for both parties to decrease the number on one side, to fund up to 3+3 billion euros, which not all of it has been actually implemented as mentioned. But all the other, obviously, issues in the agreement were not implemented. So, which are not Syrian issues. Perhaps those are Turkish, European discussions that were not implemented. So overall, I don't see that all the elements of the agreement have been implemented. Was it overall a positive one? Of course. I mean, anything that goes, as mentioned by the previous distinguished guest, Mr. Knaus, I mean, obviously a win-win situation is much better, and rather better than the pushback policies. Pushback policies are inhumane and cause further complications to the issues at hand. So, in conclusion to that, what if this were to be renewed? Obviously, the issues of compliance with international humanitarian standards is something that should be stressed, and having a monitoring or an oversight to the agreement is a necessary one from a Syrian perspective to ensure that those human rights violations are not repeated again, with overcrowded hotspots of refugees, with a lot of inhumane conditions that they continue to suffer in. Obviously, there's also issues of funding in terms of both the FREET in Turkey, but also in northern Syria. And I'm not talking about humanitarian only. People do not want to live in a temporary basis on food stamps and food baskets and so forth, but want more sustainable solutions that could stabilize their lives, that could make their children feel safe. Feeling safe means that they know that they're going to stay here at least for some time, that they could focus on helping their economic conditions, that we do need economic investments in areas to create more jobs for both host communities and for refugee communities and for IDPs in northern Syria. You know, thousands and thousands, at least 2 million IDPs, for example, in Idlib alone. But there are, with at least 1,100 camps that continue to live in tents. Those need more permanent housing that could allow for a much better humanitarian conditions that would be a preventive. So I think a balanced approach is to always deal with the push and the pull factors, meaning what pushes people to move out of their original homes is, number one, the aerial bombardment by the different forces on the ground, and then the ability to feel safe in terms of personal safety. And we've conducted a recent research on stability and security indicators in all different zones of Syria, and found out that these conditions are not close to being called safe in basic personal safety in terms of being abducted or explosives and so forth. And then number three would be to create economic empowerment projects that would allow them to prevent them from going out, whether going out from Syria or those who are in Turkey to be able to find opportunities that could go to school and could go to find sustainable jobs. So that, I mean, in conclusion, from a Syrian perspective, Syrians look at these talks as something that relates to them remotely, but not directly, because it impacts only those who decide to go into the sea, but does not impact the entire picture of 10 million people between those in Turkey and those in Syria, and those who are suffering very harsh humanitarian conditions in Lebanon and maybe less harsh in Jordan. But a lot of those are also looking at those prospects of jumping on a boat to finding more hope and more stability. So with this, I would like to end my short, commentary on this, and I thank you very much for your attention and for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ammar, for your comments. I mean, your input is very important because in the public debates, I mean, the Syrian perspective is missing. So especially the sentiment of restoring safety, restoring stability, and restoring the opportunities is usually missed in some of those high-level debates. So, and unfortunately, Turkey is a little bit left alone in especially the stability side of the story. So hopefully there will be more, in addition to the migration cooperation, there will be more strategic and security-oriented cooperation from the European side. I think this can only be achieved with that kind of understanding. So we will return you with some questions, but we will finalize our initial comments with Zeliha's presentation. So Zeliha and SETA team has been working on this EU-Turkey statement. So they have conducted interviews with some of the Syrian NGOs, Turkish officials, as well as some of the European experts. So they try to understand some of the weaknesses and possible ways to improve this agreement and some prospective moves. So I will let the ground for Zeliha. So we will publish our findings in the coming weeks. So we still continue our research and report, but Zeliha will give some idea about our research. So Zeliha, floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. First of all, I'm very pleased to see here different stakeholders regarding migration issue are represented today. And I will try here to share the Turkish point of view from my own perspective. Generally, I can say that today we are here to talk about an issue which affects both Turkey and Europe very deeply. And this migration issue is a divisive one and has a lot of aspects. Therefore, I would like to focus on the political issues regarding migration that Turkey faces and not getting into the details. When we listen to the news on the media, we see that the perspective lies always on the European side. Mostly, we see news and coverage from the European point of view, especially in the Western media. On the other side, we have also Turkish academicians or politicians who reflect the European point of view, even in the Turkish public opinion, and, which is very unfortunately. Turkey, therefore I want especially to address the frustration that Turkey feels regarding the migration issue. Turkey sees here that there is a lack of effort on the European Union side to address the migration crisis. By considering this statement, it's important to focus on the context in which the agreement was signed, the framework of the agreement, of the statement, and the conditions at the time in both Turkey and Europe are very relevant. And of course, we have to consider also the Syrian part. While the Europeans and the international media were reporting on Syrian war, a real drama was happening directly on the Turkish border with Syria. Until the pictures of drowning children reached the European media, the EU had no choice but to begin to pay attention. Migrant waves moving towards and through Europe caused a panic situation in Brussels, in Europe. When it comes to Turkey, it has always been a route for migrants to Europe because of its geopolitical situation. People from countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and the Middle East have always been going through Turkey in order to get to Europe. I mean, this is a simple fact. After the Syrian war started, the migration stream increased tenfold. Overnight, Syrians drove towards Europe via Turkey because they wanted to survive and reach Europe. Neither Turkey nor the EU was ready to such a development, as mentioned before. And what happened then? Because of the intensity of the war in Syria and because of the inhuman conditions the refugees were living under, they were prepared to accept the consequences of traveling to Greece via non-official means. Some may ask, why Greece? The framework for migrants had changed because Europe had changed the rules for the migrant application. The Dublin Convention had been applied since 2013. Migrants could no longer apply in the country of their choice. They had to apply to the closest EU country to the Middle East, which is Greece. I would like to draw your attention to the name of the statement. It's named, as you know, Turkey-EU statement. It's not named migration statement. And it has some, it's for reasons, of course. The agreement signed on 18 March was not only about migration. Basically, migration was only a part of it. There were many other important issues. Furthermore, the relationship between EU and Turkey was not very good before the agreement. By means of the statement, both sides saw some chances to improve relations between each other, and to solve the migration issue at the same time. It could or should be a new start to a fractured relationship. Furthermore, on both sides, everyone believed the war would be short-lived and the migrants would return home very soon. And Turkey realized that the cooperation between the EU and Turkey could be improved in the long term through this statement. If we look at the context of the statement, we see that there are some issues related to this part, such as the custom union point and relaxation of visa rules for travel, etc. Which country accepts millions of migrants without support? And the citizens of Turkey were also expecting to have a better relationship with the EU and have some benefits. However, when we look at the Geneva Convention, according to the agreement which Turkey had signed, for example, Normally, Turkey only had to accept migrants from the west, but Turkey was accepting migrants from the east as well, and without discriminating between migrants. This is also the reason why Turkey didn't give and couldn't give these migrants the legal status of a refugee. These migrants only got temporary protection in Turkey. Europe legally has to accept migrants from everywhere, but in practice, it is the opposite. It's not happening, and actually crossing the EU borders is contrary to the EU's international law and EU's pledge to protect refugees and migrants. When it comes to the expectations, what happened and where we are now, the responsibility for the burden of these migrants was to be shared between two sides. However, in practice, the EU wanted to stop the migrants coming to the EU and keep them in Turkey. I mean, that was the only intention of the EU, to keep the problem away from the European side and in Turkey. Promises were made by EU to accept a part of the burden and help with the financial burden. However, these promises never happened. Visa liberalization never happened. The custom union revision was never made. And Turkey was left to its own means and instruments. And when we consider the other conditions, when we look what are the chances to renew this statement, because there is a need for renewing this statement, as mentioned before, because we needed this statement, because the Geneva Convention and the other conventions and statements was not enough to handle, to deal with migration problems today. And we, where are the future steps that Turkey and EU need to take? Unfortunately, the Geneva Agreement and other agreements have lost their functionality. The world needs a new migration law, as Gerald Knaus mentioned. But more importantly, there must be a common policy on this issue, within the EU and outside the EU. The Syrian conflict has been going on for more than 10 years, and unless the EU and Turkey come to a common agreement, this conflict could go on for a lot longer time. The Syrians will continue to be the ones that pay the price for an outdated and non-functional agreement. Neither Syrians nor Turkey should have to pay the price for the divisions and interest conflicts within the EU in the first place. And Turkey and the EU actually want this agreement updated, because Europe pretends that the problem has been solved because of the number of refugees arriving at its borders. Its borders have been reduced by Turkey. Many problems persist late. The resources transferred under the agreement have been used in the projects and needed to be continued and increased. In addition, Turkish institutions and bureaucracies that bear the main burden in the distribution of the money, and the problems should be given more authority. The Turkish institutions need to be given more authority, and the Turkish government and institutions should be trusted in research management, just as they can be trusted to take Syrians. I mean, when it comes to taking Syrians to Turkey, nobody talks about the human rights or about the claims that Turkey is not a law state. But if it comes to the conditions related to this statement, visa liberalization and custom union, everybody then begins to talk about these conditions, about the human rights, etc. It is a very clear condition. It is very, it is double moral, let's say. And what are the chances to renew this statement? From my perspective, the impression is being given that the EU divisions are being manipulated, so that the countries are playing the blame game and are effectively stalling for time by blaming other member states for not wanting to update the agreement. And this strategy is now very old and getting stale very quickly and can no longer be tolerated. If the EU claims to be a union, then they should act as such and take concrete steps to revise this agreement to the benefit of the EU, Turkey, and more importantly, the migrants who have no one to take care of them. Neither Syrians or Turkey should have to pay the price for the problems, for the, as I mentioned before, for the divisions within the EU. And there is also a point, on the Turkish side, what happened on the Turkish side while European was ignoring the problem. Turkey has fully fulfilled its responsibility. NGOs such as the Migration Agency and the Red Crescent have done a great job in this regard. They are doing a job that 27 European countries cannot. Of course, there are problems, but that's normal because Turkey is a big country and has a huge borders, and it's also challenged by domestic and regional problems. And while at the same time, Turkey is responsible for migrants' well-being, countries like Russia and Syria do not care for what happens to these migrants, and even go so far and need to target the Turkish military presence protecting the migrants. Turkey does all this while the EU does fairly little and does not put its hand under the rug, but still finds time to criticize Turkey on its migration control efforts. And there is a point I would like to really highlight. I think there must be a question to be addressed. Why didn't Europe take these refugees from 27 EU countries? Because it's always said it is a political problem, it's an economic problem, it is because of the far right, etc. We always hear this argument. I would suppose that is an economic problem. Turkey and Lebanon are no richer than the 27 EU countries. Here again, we see that there is no common decision within the Union and that the refugee crisis cannot be managed politically. As many as 25% of its population as refugees, while European countries are unable to take them, except Germany, of course, a political incompetence and a failure of so-called European values. And it is an example of hypocritical politics, actually. President Erdogan asked for support, not only for migration, but for the creation of safe zones and for the fight against terrorism in northern Syria, because it's not about money, like many claim. However, neither politically and from the security side or from the humanitarian side, Europe has put its hand up in Syria. The UN and EU act only in their own interests, unfortunately, when it comes to Syria, and they do not act and pretend it's somebody else's problem or ignore the issues. It's mentioned a lot before. And from my perspective, I would say, let's remember one thing, lastly. Turkey has carried out a series of military operations to establish safe zones for returns in Syria, because it's not about money, it's not about the problems we have within Turkey, because the problem has not begun within Turkey, it's begun outside of Turkey, it's begun in Syria. And not to forget, the Turkish South borders are European borders. It is about not only about the Turkish security, it's about the European security as well. And Turkey has carried out a series of military operations to establish safe zones for returns in Syria, even losing soldiers in the process. However, the EU countries initially opposed these operations, but could not stand by this opposition because of the refugee issue. We have to consider that. This means, this showed once again how justified Turkey was in its action, even in its military actions. So I think it's all what I say now, and we can continue maybe with questions section.
Thank you, Zeliha. So now we completed our first round with the presentations of our panelists, but we have some questions with regard to their presentations and in general the migration statement. So what I'm going to do is we have 20 minutes, so we will probably have 1 or 2 rounds of Q&A. I will start with the order of presentation and start with Dr. Naus. So the question of, Chancellor Angela Merkel played significant role and significant leadership in this deal. So I think she was key to this agreement. So the questions, especially from Turkey and Syrians, is that if there's a change in, leadership in Germany, will this agreement still continue? I mean, what will be the side effects of, we know that there are some elections, and we also know that Merkel will not be candidate. So how will this affect the process? And secondly, the question of monitoring is very important. I think this, you mentioned, although Frontex is established as a mechanism, but it's not a humanitarian, humane mechanism. I think this, it doesn't necessarily fulfill the monitoring for the sake of humane concerns. So what can be an alternative monitoring mechanisms, not just for this agreement, but, the inhumane pushbacks? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Shall I go ahead, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure. Well, first on Germany, the EU, and the state of the agreement, my take is slightly different. I mean, I would say that what we have at the moment is already a worse, a lose situation. Because what do we have? FRIT 2 has all been programmed, and there is no FRIT 3. Now, I agree, of course, that much more would and should need to be done to improve the livelihoods of Syrians. But at this moment, 1.7 million Syrians in Turkey get support from FRIT, social support. There is funding has been a lot of funding for education, for healthcare. And if this would go away and not be replaced at a time of an economic crisis in Turkey and in the world, because of the pandemic, because of lack of tourism, etc., I mean, this would be a very bad policy. So at this moment, there is no FRIT 3 on the table. This needs to change. It's not about money just buying a closed border. There are those in the EU who say, let's not give Turkey any money and let's do pushbacks. It's cheaper. And I think those in the EU who say this is not a good policy because the European Union has an interest in conditions for Syrians in Turkey improve. So first, on FRIT, the status quo is not good. Second, in the Aegean, the status quo is terrible on the islands and on the border. I mean, we know that. How do we change that? And third, the part of the agreement that talks about humanitarian access and support and in conditions in Syria, the more than 3 million people, at least 2 million IDPs in northwest Syria. Not much has happened on this. Now, when I think that this should be raised in a revised agreement, that one should say this should become one of the top issues, not just in dialogue between the EU and Turkey, but in dialogue between the EU, Turkey, and America and the United States. What is the future of these 3 million people? They will not disappear. Their conditions are very bad. They could get much worse. This is not a stable situation. And here I think we need to think a little bit inspired by historical precedent. When there was a real problem, an unresolved problem of a large number of refugees and migrants in the South China Sea, the UN put together a conference where the key players came together. And in 20 years, more than 2 million people were resettled from Southeast Asia. The United States took the lead then. Now it would have to be Turkey and the EU, but others in the rest of the world should seriously think together what to do about the terrible situation of Syrians in Syria. Now, all of this will only happen if we have a renewed agreement and restore the rule of law on the EU-Turkey border. And that is why, if Turkey puts this on the table as soon as possible, all the other issues need to be discussed as well. This is not a magic wand. This will not address a lot of the problems Ammar Kahf rightly pointed to. But if we can't even do this, if we can't even deal with 15,000 people on Greek islands, if we can't even prolong a working program, FRIT, then all the rest is very theoretical. So that's why I think let's have a renewed statement, and then let's have a framework of serious discussions on all the many open issues. And Angela Merkel's departure, I don't think this will change much, but I think the biggest threat is if we don't get a new statement quickly, the number of people in the European Union who get used to the current policy of pushbacks is growing. People in Europe, like in America, people might say what Trump did, it was brutal, but it worked. People didn't come across the Mexican border. It's Joe Biden, President Biden has not changed that yet. He still has Trump's policy. If the US and Europe both have basically closed borders, well, what's the future of the Refugee Convention? The sooner we show there are other ways of having humane control, the better for all of us.
Thank you. So, Ammar, we know that Syrian refugees have certain rights protected by international conventions. However, they had very limited opportunities to use these frameworks for their protection. And one key indicator in the last maybe 5 years was, of course, Trump's presidency in the US. I mean, he was not in favor of this kind of multilateral framework. So, are there any efforts by Syrian refugees, Syrian actors to renew these efforts, international forums, multilateral forums, and also a little bit more advocacy, especially for the political deal in this regard? Or is the things as usual as we see in the last couple of years?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, is are there any initiatives from the Syrian perspective to resolve the migration issue or the overall political problem?
I mean, both migration issue at international, along with the international conventions, as well as broader political discussions.
Well, I mean, one thing is that Syrians are generally not present in a lot of the international agreements, whether on the political, on the security, on the refugee policies of different countries. Now, I mean, maybe today we have a little bit more of an opening in the US, but so far the US has not really taken many refugees from Syria. The numbers are very ridiculous in terms of a very small, less than 30,000. Even some numbers estimated at close to 10,000. But and obviously within the Trump was almost close to zero, if not even negative in that sense. I mean, there is a temporary protection status of quite a significant number in the U.S. But generally speaking, again, Syrians are barely, as Syrian institutions, nonprofit organizations, as civil society organizations, are dealing with the aftermath and are overwhelmed with continued cuts of funding from the international community, lately some of the ex-European countries that have cut funding, meaning there's only one ex-EU member so far. So I mean, the worry is more funding cuts to stabilization programs, to humanitarian programs that are unfortunately coming, especially in the wake of the COVID-19. So that adds another layer of challenge to a lot of Syrian NGOs and civil society organizations that deal with IDPs and migration issues in not just Turkey, but also in the other neighboring countries that continue to host significant numbers, and without any basic services in both Lebanon and Jordan. And so, one of the initiatives I can say, but perhaps a small one that we have done at our institution is we established a job placement program in Turkey to help Syrians and Turks also additionally to integration programs through jobs, through creation of jobs and initiatives of local development, entrepreneurship, small grants, and so forth. And this also, our other relief institution within our consortium has implemented inside Syria. Those remain very small in number. I mean, the issue is much greater than what a single or even more institutions. In terms of advocacy, Syrians have become way more organized than before in terms of collectively advocating for their rights to be respected in especially migration issues, that there are now coalitions that go across continents, getting the diaspora engaged from the US, from some of the European countries that have Syrian organizations and nonprofit organizations. Collectively, especially now the upcoming Brussels meeting at the end of this month, to deliver our messages in terms of the rights and responsibilities of those who have been unjustly pushed out of Syria because of the systematic aggressions of the government. And so we have been doing, as Syrian communities and NGOs have been doing way more than what is expected of us, I believe. We can certainly do more. Our advocacy on the political is, again, Syrians are, Syria has become an internationalized conflict, that there's 5 militaries on the ground, and Syrians on all sides of the aisle are used as proxies as a post office to deliver messages from Russia to the US or from one country to another. Which is very unfortunate, and so obviously we have been pushing for a sustainable peace process to be pushed, and as part of that peace process, as a result of the process, not before. And this is one of the issues that we have published our recent report on the return of refugees and the creation of a safe environment. Is that this is a political right, not a governmental issue. That this is a right for Syrians that have been pushed out of their countries to return to their original homes. And this is an outcome of the political process, not a precondition, not something that could be overlooked just because there are bilateral talks by some of the countries engaged on the Syrian ground. So I don't know if I answered the question correctly. I tried to understand it as much as possible and addressed the question that you posed to me.
Yeah, of course, there was disappointment, a little bit disillusionment with the multilateral frameworks and international institutions during the Trump era. Is there any renewed activity in the change or renewed expectations? We know that President Erdogan yesterday has published an article in Bloomberg and about this renewed effort to end Syrian conflict. So I'm not sure whether the Syrian counterparts are also pushing more in the advocacy side and in more political efforts in these lines.
Indeed, as I mentioned, the Syrian American community in the US have come together and established several lobby groups, and whether official lobbies, political action committees, or advocacy platform, and have submitted papers to the Biden administration in terms of what are the options to the new era on dealing with the Syria crisis. Similarly, also the British Syrian Council has done certain consistent efforts with the British government. And I'm also familiar, as I mentioned, to the upcoming Brussels conference the Syria Brussels conference at the end of this month, that Syrians have consistently collaborated to push on specific policies and advocate for specific policies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Zeliha, I'm going to ask you, I mean, of course, Turkey is criticized a lot by European politicians, some, media experts, commentators, especially the issue of Pazar Kule, and furthermore, the allegations with regard to Turkey using migrants for its political purposes. What is the story behind? I mean, why, this story, Turkey using the migrants, has such a coverage, and what's the substance of this debate?
Yeah, it's right. There are such claims, and I find it significant to correct this narrative that very people believe in. And Turkey had weaponized, or is weaponizing its migration policy. This is actually an EU narrative, and to call its own failure and place the Turkish side in a difficult situation in front of the international community and international media. And unfortunately, some Turkish oppositional parties or groups are also taking these claims. And this criticism received by Turkey for opening the Pazar Kule border crossing has been very misunderstood, I think. Turkey had no other option but to open the crossing due to the massive influx of migrants on its borders. And it seems that the only way Turkey can get a reaction from the EU is when it's forced to take drastic actions such as the opening of the borders. And let me also remembering the last opinion written by Erdogan, by the President Erdogan. He also highlighted this point, and he again warned Europe to take some actions regarding the migration issue.
Okay, so we have just a couple of minutes. So rather than getting into a new topic, I would like to ask some superficial questions. So to all our panelists, I mean, what would you be your 3 recommendations to both either Turkish or European officials to make this agreement better and to continue this agreement? So maybe it may be simple, but what is your view on this, Gerald? And
as I said, we've just put a proposal for a new a revised statement building on the previous one online, so everybody can read it. It's based on a lot of consultations we had in recent months with policymakers in many capitals. There are 3 things: build on what had worked. Definitely continue supporting Syrians in Turkey. It's not a solution to their difficult situation, but it would be terrible to stop it. Secondly, create a framework in which the whole issue of Syrian migration and refugees and internally displaced can be seriously and regularly discussed, and create a framework that is ideally isolated from the rest of tense relations. The fate of people in northwest Syria should not depend on other issues in EU-Turkey relations. If you care about the Refugee Convention and human rights, you should care about this. So create a framework for this. There will be a concrete recommendation. But the third and most urgent recommendation is, I can see us having another half a year of discussions another year of discussions. In the meantime, people will still be on Lesbos, people will still be pushed back. There will be no Frit 3. You know, that would be a wasted opportunity that would also send a terrible signal to the world from Europe's border on the Refugee Convention. This is not an acceptable status quo. So the sooner somebody puts on the table an agreement that is serious and focused, the better. That would be my recommendation. And I hope, I mean, I know SETA is, you're listened to in Ankara. You've had a lot of powerful people in Ankara who've been at SETA. You're a think tank, you're respected with your analysis. If you can help make that case that this is yes, it's in the European interest. Yes, it's in the interest of refugees. It's also in Turkey's interest to move quickly on this. Not everyone in Europe wants that, but I still see some European capitals that would be not well in their own self-interest and because it's the morally right thing to do. That would be responsive, I hope.
Thank you. We are trying our best with slow efforts, but I think I'm hoping we are heading to the right direction. So, Ammar, what would be 3 practical things to make life of Syrians better in this limbo situation? We know that there is no new agreement, and we know that there are major problems with. So, what is your suggestion about 1 or 2 suggestions about practical suggestion Turkish or European authorities should take in order to make lives of Syrians better in this, refugee issue?
I mean, I'm not sure I can add more to what the distinguished speaker before me, Mr. Knaus, was mentioning. And so, I mean, obviously, and to make sure that there's no gap in the agreement. So if the gap expires and we have a gap by the time we renegotiate the new deal, the human suffering will be huge. And maybe by the time a new agreement is reached, we would have different conditions to deal with. And so an immediate, either an extension or an immediate new agreement should be revised and implemented. In the meantime, I think also discussions should start in parallel to discuss what are the conditions that could be done, policies that could be done in northern Syria and in southern Turkey, where most refugees reside, in terms of economic empowerment projects and local good governance projects that make people at least have some hope and create hope for them, stories of hope and success that they could at least temporarily stabilize their lives and rebuild their lives, hopefully. I mean, if the political process moves, then that would be my next wish. But so far, it doesn't seem that there are indicators of any other party that is engaged in the conflict willing to move this peace process forward. So the minimum that we could do is to make sure that people's lives are protected, that human rights are respected in the Greek islands and in anywhere that refugees are living.
Thank you. So Zeliha, you are in touch with Turkish bureaucrats, officials, and NGO staff that are dealing with this issue. So what are their practical expectations? How would you?
Yes, I totally agree what is said before by Knaus and by Kahf. I would say Turkish side must be more involved in the managing of the financial resources, and on the both sides, European and Turkey, we need more transparency. It is a big problem in the dealing with projects and money management, and the migration issue is still a big field to cooperation between EU and Turkey, and we have to use this opportunity and not to miss that. I think the responsible people and experts have to come often together to talk about the issue. And we need, on the macro level, we need a very new attitude to the migration issue, because the Geneva Conventions and the other statements are not enough. And by dealing the migration problem we have today, and I think therefore to renew this statement should be the priority of the EU and of Turkey.
Mm-hmm. So
maybe maybe we have to look what's working and what has worked until now, and what has not really worked well, and change some points in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zeliha. So probably for each parties, what worked best, definition of what worked best may be different. So I think coming to the shared understanding, at least, because we know that in the last couple of years, there is some split between Turkish authorities and the European authorities on several political issues. I think improving, restoring some trust, restoring some, joint efforts probably is the priority for making more substantive moves. So I think that's why Ambassador Kalın's efforts and other high-level efforts are also very important to move forward in more concrete steps in this migration issue and other issues as well. So, but your suggestions, your recommendations, analysis are very important. I think this is a very important and significant debate going on. I think this debate will have some resonance in Turkish public and decision makers. And I think keeping this issue, this debate is also very important. We will, as SETA, we will try to keep this discussion, conversation alive. But for today's session, today's panel, I would like to thank all of you, starting with Ambassador Kalın, Burhanettin, Duran, Gerald, Ammar, and Zeliha. So this is just some limited effort to keep this discussion, debate in Turkish public. So we are hoping to have the fruits of this genuine conversation, genuine plans in the coming months or probably coming weeks. So I would also like to thank to our audience who are following us from different medium. So we will try to keep the videos available in different contexts. So also we know that Gerald, Zeliha, Ammar, you all have interesting reports and published stuff. So I also recommend our audience to just go back and read, maybe review some of the published work and follow the ongoing discussion in that video as well. So I would like to thank all of you and close this panel with good wishes. Thank you.